Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Tabman, and welcome to Crimes and Times. Tonight, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with an expert in a field we've been hearing a lot about lately. We're going to talk about the victim of sex crimes and harassment and a profile of the offender. Please welcome us with Dr. Laura McGuire. Laura, welcome to Crimes and Times.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have to tell you, I have your picture up there from your profile, and the backdrop you have there is much more attractive than my bland background here, which reminds us that we have to do something about that. So anyway, tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, and what drove you into that field of study.
Yeah. So I am a sexologist and educator, and my main areas in those fields are focused on trauma, sexual trauma, both the prevention of, recovery, and then also the long-term effects of sexual harassment, assault, and all different kinds of misconduct, everything from stalking to domestic violence to sexual exploitation. And then the other part of what I do is I focus a lot on inclusion, particularly of the LGBTQ community. And a lot of those areas really intersect because when you're dealing with issues of marginalization or exclusion or oppression, you're going to deal with a lot of different kinds of victimization. And so my work focuses on helping both individuals and systems and agencies understand these issues and be proactive in preventing and addressing them. So
I'm saying your practice now, I know you don't have a typical client, I don't mean that, but when I say what would be the cross-section of people you get coming into your practice, and what kind of help do they need, and what generally has been their victimization?
Mm-hmm. So a large amount of victims that I work with are survivors of sexual assault and rape. I would say that's the majority, but I do see, again, issues with harassment, stalking, domestic violence, dating violence. And really, it varies widely across ages. I've worked with everyone from children to senior citizens. The majority of the work I've done the past couple of years is largely in college campuses, so I work a lot with young adults. And before this work, I worked largely with teens, so it's mostly teens, young adults, and those are the majority of the victims that I'm working with. But then I also work with the systems that play into their care and prevention, which are, again, college campuses. It can be businesses, schools that are K through 12. So it's a wide variety of both individuals and agencies.
And what brought you to that kind of work? Was it a certain motivation?
Yeah. So it's an interesting story. I did not go to school at all until I was in my mid-20s. I got married very young. I didn't finish high school, and I got my GED because I was in an abusive marriage and knew that probably the only way I was going to get myself and my child out of that situation was through education. And not only did I get my GED, but within 12 months, I had my bachelor's degree in social sciences, and then I went on and got my master's and EDD in 2 years after that. So from my GED to my EDD was 4 years and 8 months.
How did you do that?
And,
how did you move so quickly?
I found programs that were state schools that allowed the students to self-pace. Mm-hmm. And, it is a kind of both a miraculous and really interesting story, and I've had people have a hard time believing it, but really what it comes down to was motivation. I knew that the story I was in and the life I was leading was not the right one for me. I knew that I had a lot to potentially offer the world, and without an education, I wasn't going to be able to do that. And so that's what led me into teaching, and I taught at-risk teen girls, 6th through 12th grade, and then that really spurred me on to go to graduate school and focus on improving our conversations around sexuality, particularly from a trauma-informed perspective.
Interesting. And I have to ask you a question on a personal level now. Having heard women speak about these abusive relationships, what I know from my experience, mostly more as a police officer than as an FBI agent, while you were going to school, was that something you had to keep a secret from your husband?
I didn't have to keep it a secret. However, while on one hand, on the surface, he was supportive, he also wasn't supportive in practical ways. I had a very hard time just, making time to study, making time to take exams and go to classes and such. So, it was both sides of the coin. On one hand, supportive. On the other hand, it definitely wasn't a priority I felt for him. And so that was a struggle, especially because I had one young child, and then while I was getting my bachelor's degree, I gave birth to my second child. But then after that, I was able to leave him and start a better life for all of us.
The reason I ask that is, again, we look at the profile, a word we like to use often. When you have that kind of abusive relationship, whether it be physical and or mental, isn't there always a threat to the man of losing control? And one way to lose control is for you to have the power and the ability to walk away. You won't be dependent on him anymore. And that's why I thought I'd ask that question, if maybe he saw that or he sensed you were doing that in a way to regain some of your power so you could exercise that and walk away. Did you have a sense that he was fearing that while you were going to school?
I think I did sense a little bit of that, and I think some of it was in, again, both him not necessarily giving me a lot of support on a practical level, but then also kind of downplaying what I was trying to accomplish. The bigger clue I see looking back, now that I work in this field and I know, like you said, the dynamics, was that when we got married, like I said, I had left high school, I was homeschooled, and I didn't finish my studies, and he had just graduated from like a very prestigious school with a degree that would make a lot of money. And I think his insecurities and his behaviors to be aggressive, to be emotionally manipulative and abusive, was looking for someone like me, subconsciously, who couldn't provide for themselves, who couldn't walk away, who, would be dependent and kind of glorify this person who could earn so much more and knew so much more, quote unquote, than I, this lowly high school dropout. So I think that's one of the things I talk about with young people now, particularly in high school and college, is do not leave your studies thinking that someone is going to be your savior or provide for you, because that's a really great, dynamic. That's a petri dish for abuse to just flourish and grow. You want to be stable completely on your own in order to find a healthy relationship.
Right. You kind of look back now and figure, with all your accomplishments, how do you let that happen? Or do you look back and say, thank goodness I made the move and I had the strength that I did?
Well, I think it's both. I think I look back and, definitely think, why did I think it was a good idea? But I look at the situation, the culture I grew up in. I'm the first person in my family to finish an undergraduate degree. Nobody else had accomplished that. So I saw a lot of women in my family who were dependent on men, who, told me that being independent or going to school, much less getting a doctorate in anything, was going to be essentially impossible. And so I understand why I made those decisions. And, I believe that I don't believe everything happens for a reason. I think that's very much sometimes a part of victim blaming in our culture. But I do think everything has a lesson. And one of the ultimate lessons is to pass on what you've learned to other people. And so that's why I got into the area that I'm in, because I knew what I had learned, and I knew that education was the ticket into the life that I wanted, and I knew that was something that I could then give to other people, women, but people of every gender, moving forward. And that's why I'm very passionate about what I do.
Right. You made just several good points I was thinking as you're talking them. One is education being the ticket. And I think, you and I agree, if we could give no better message to any person out there thinking, how could I change my life? Even if they're not in an abusive relationship, just want to make things better. Education is the ticket. It'll give you a skill set
Yep.
that very few other people have. But we share a philosophy. I look at things. I very rarely try to tell people that, that happened for a reason. Let's try to mitigate the badness with, assuming there's a silver lining. And there isn't always. But that doesn't mean we can't make a bad situation better. It doesn't mean we can take out life has maybe really screwed us over. It doesn't mean we can't learn a lesson from that, take a different direction, and just make things better for us. It doesn't have to be the end or the continuation of a sad situation. So I agree with you on that. And the other important point you made is that when you're talking about yourself, you talk about your culture, your situation. And I always try to stress that to people because it's so easy to sit back and say, oh, how'd they let that happen? That wouldn't happen to me. If that was me, I'd do this, I would do that. No one would abuse me. But you weren't there. You weren't in that situation. You weren't that person. And we have to recognize that everybody's situation is different. Everybody is not in control at a certain moment in their life. And you don't know what you would have done had you been there. And we need to be a little less judgmental on people who find themselves in these situations. We're always thinking, oh, I could have done this, I could have done that. You don't know until you've been there, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Totally agree.
So, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on now is we've talked on my show about, the profile. We had cyberbullying on recently. We've talked about abusive relationships. We talk about the sexual offender. But again, we have stories that keep coming up in the news that remind us we don't know it all, and we seem to get surprised every time something new happens. And one of the stories that's making around the country is these accusations, and they're nothing more than that now, of a governor in Missouri, Governor Greitens. And supposedly, before he was in office, he had this affair. He's married, had an affair with a woman, and he tied her up and blindfolded her, took pictures, and threatened her that if she ever revealed this, he would release the pictures to embarrass her, and that was his threat. Now, before we get in the conversation, just for the record, these are allegations only. We don't know what he did, and I'm not looking to try the case. But what I'd like to do is to just sort of look at that scenario from your perspective as if it was anybody else, powerful man, vulnerable woman. And just tell us what your initial instincts are, your initial feelings. You're going to read this story, and then I want to talk about what you see in terms of victimology and the profile. Again, forgetting who the players are, just in the generic sense of this instance, of who the offender might be, the victim might be, and the circumstances. Okay? All right, so,
yeah, no, it is a very interesting case. And I think it brings to light a number of different issues that go into just abusive dynamics, and that there were a couple of things going on in that scenario according to, again, like you said, the allegations, that fall into a couple of categories of sexual violence. So one, we have this extreme power differential. We have somebody who is, in a position where they hold a lot of power. To be a governor of a state is going to give you just a lot of leverage. It's both legally, socially, and psychologically. That's a lot of power. Let me
interrupt for a second. Excuse me, I just hit the camera here. Supposedly this happened before he was in office. But he was an up-and-comer, a good-looking guy, a Navy SEAL. And again, let's forget who he was personally, but let's look at that persona. All right, because again, I don't want to accuse him. So even not being officially in power, but someone who's clearly rising to power, someone who just has a status in our social beings of being good-looking, having served in the military, the things we respect. Is that a power differential in an informal, different way?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And that could even be, let's say a family dynamic, a family friend or a relative where there's a member of that family who is greatly admired. They're known to be, the one that gets stuff done, that helps everybody out when they're in a tough situation, that hosts holidays, that for whatever different reasons is held in high esteem. If that person then wants to go and abuse that power, that privilege, and again, that kind of authority that they have in that familial connection, they absolutely can. And if they prey on somebody who, in that group, that family can be also a workplace, a different employee or a boss, they want to prey on somebody who, is more isolated, is less likely to be believed. Maybe they have lower self-esteem. They don't feel like they fit in. You know, that's that same kind of dynamic. So whether he held, you know, the office officially yet, or he just had, again, all that presence, all that power being influenced. And this person, I think she was a hairdresser, if I'm not wrong. You know, it sounds like, again, she was in a much lower position socially, economically, all these different things than this other individual. So if that person then pressures, you know, the victim, or tries to persuade them or tries to coerce them, then they cannot be actually consenting to anything.
Very good point. Because people will say, but she said yes.
Right. So that's a really important thing for us to kind of unpack is, what is consent? You know, one of the things I like to say when I'm in a group presenting, I say, okay, everybody raise your hand if you grew up in a culture of consent. And nobody should raise their hand. Because the reality is, not even if we grew up with good parents and a good town and it was low crime and everyone was kind to each other, we still all grew up with the same movies and messages and songs and images that told us that a lot of things that violate consent are romantic or funny or just in some way okay. And so people don't really recognize what consent is and isn't. And thus that's a lot of what I do is educate people on the complexities of that.
Right, and I think it's easier for people, you know, who are confident, that maybe you gain that confidence over life. I'm certainly more confident now than I was a little kid. You know, you obviously are more confident now than you were years ago. But not everyone, you know, is born with that confidence or has had a life-changing experience to bring it to them. So it's easy for us who have confidence to say, "Oh, just you know, suck it up. Just say no."
Right.
But it's easy to talk. But again, you're born with a certain personality, and you have your strengths and your weaknesses. And until you've conquered those weaknesses, just doing that is not easy to do, right? There's something inside you that's preventing you from just saying no, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, and again, that goes back to, we were even talking about culture. There's so many situational factors. One is power differential, but the other is, you know, being socialized gender-wise. I mean, women are told, be nice, be polite. A lot of that has to do with saying yes to whatever somebody wants and not getting them upset with you. That's also racial and ethnic. You know, I mean, if you are part of a minority and you are a person of color, you more, again, than socialize that if somebody holds power and is in a certain position, that you might get in really big trouble for saying no to them or standing up against them. And one of the big things with consent is, you know, that it's not the absence of a no, it's the presence of a yes. Consent has to be affirmative and enthusiastic for it to count as consent. So if somebody is saying yes, but they're being coerced or threatened or manipulated, that yes is negated. It doesn't count. It's not real. You know, because again, it's a yes, please don't hurt me. Yes, I don't want to get in trouble. Yes, you know, I'm scared. Not yes, I actually want to do this. So I think it's really important. And again, people have a hard time sometimes wrapping their head around this. But it's important for us to talk about that there are those differences in those yeses. And it has to be, again, affirmative, enthusiastic, informed, and ongoing.
Well, that's a great point. And I'm thinking back, even in my era when I was a kid, growing up, and things certainly have changed, fortunately. But I grew up in that era, looking at the movies, your lips said no, but your eyes said yes. You know, that message. And we all, as young men, grew up with that message, you know, of male dominance, that she didn't really mean no. And I went to John Jay College, and I was getting ready to go into my police career back in the late 70s. And I remember even then, fortunately, things were changing. But it was very recent. I remember taking a class with one of the founding sergeants of the New York City Sex Crimes Unit. And it was only in that era that they were starting to understand how to treat a woman who'd been sexually assaulted, you know, mostly raped, because when she would go and report it to the police, they said she was raped again, just by the verbal abuse or the lack of believing. that they would have on the police department. So I know there's been a lot of training on first responders, mostly police, certainly over the course of my career, that made mostly men understand the emotional support a woman has to have. And I can't help but remember this other story when I was a little younger, but it's again in the 70s, not that long ago, when a very famous weatherman in New York City, was right after a story about a rape, and he made the comment, well, you know what they say, if it's going to happen, just sit back and enjoy it. Now, he lost his job and his career based on that, but even the 70s, at that time, everyone knew that was wrong. What kind of culture could we have been in where someone thought he could get on television and say something like that? Back then, it just shows the power of that message that was so wrong all those years we're growing up. Any comment about that before we go on to the next thing?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that people still, I have to say, because I teach a lot of, like I said, college age, high school age people, that is still common belief is that somebody can be saying no, but they don't really mean it. And that's actually a phenomenon in sociology that's been studied called token compliance and token resistance. And that is true, that there are some, again, what we call sexual scripts where people feel like, especially women, I need to say, I'm not sure, I don't know what I want in order to seem like a good girl, quote unquote. But again, that's where we want to teach people that that's not okay for either party. It's not okay for one person to feel like they have to, not say what they really want and not express their desires affirmatively. And it's not okay for someone else to assume that there's an underlying message that they somehow can mind read. We need people to teach themselves, teach their peers, teach their children, a lot of this is on parents, that we need to communicate clearly, effectively, and honestly, because there's no other way that we're going to eradicate rape culture. And then as far as media, we still see that. We still see that very often, and sometimes it's in more nowadays, I guess, subliminal ways, more hidden ways. For example, when we see sexual assault of males, we see a lot of this still. We hear a lot of prison rape jokes that still get, okayed by society as somehow funny. When again, that's just as serious of a sexual assault as if it was a female victim. We still see that in stories in the media when they talk about, a female teacher assaulting a male student. Usually they'll say they had a relationship or they had sex. They won't say that the male student was raped, which is the reality of the situation. So I think there's actually still a lot of that. Thank goodness we've at least kind of, as a society, said one layer of it isn't okay, but there's so many layers underneath that we still haven't got to that are just as problematic, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense to me, again, looking back on my experience from education. And I think, and taking it to the extreme of, a sexual assault that's actual rape, there's so many layers, as you said. There's one, your loss of control, traumatic. A violent act perpetrated on you, traumatic. I mean, no one wants to get punched or kicked or whatever. You don't want to get hurt. You don't want to be abused. But then if you add the penetration of the body, irrespective of how the assault occurs, that is adding trauma onto trauma onto trauma. And I think we forget just how much someone goes through, male or female, when they've actually been raped, and the body's actually been penetrated unwillingly. The trauma is just almost incomprehensible. And have you seen that, in terms of maybe being a little different, or I don't want to say less, but maybe just make it that much harder to get over than someone who maybe was just sexually assaulted without the penetration? Do you see a difference in the level of trauma in the people you treated?
That's tough. I think that there's two kind of layers to this. One is that we definitely want to make sure people understand that, any kind of sexual trauma assault is, there's not a hierarchy of this one's the worst and this one's the least, and if you're in the least, you don't need as much help or you don't deserve as many resources, right? Because people, again, socially still say those kinds of things to each other, even to themselves. On the other hand, I definitely think, there is, the factor of the physical damage that's done when someone is penetrated, the additional dangers of STDs, unwanted pregnancies, that just compound that trauma. But it's really interesting because one of the things that I've seen come up that, again, is an area that we still, as a society and as people in this field, need to continue to talk about and explore, is the fact that so many sexual assaults aren't the kind of violence that we see on, Law and Order SVU. Somehow, in every presentation I give, somebody brings up Law and Order SVU. And I try to tell them, that's a certain percentage of assaults. There's so many where there isn't blood and crying and, torn clothes. And the problem with that is that those victims really don't believe they have a right to come forward. Again, talking about male victims, but actually it happens with every gender, is the fact that a lot of times assault, a molestation, even rape can feel neurologically, physically pleasurable. And again, especially for male survivors, that's a huge, huge thing, but we've seen it with female survivors too, where they might experience, feelings of sexual pleasure, even orgasm. That is really, really hard to talk about, when you want to come forward and say you were assaulted, but your body betrayed you. Your neurology just reacted. The same way, your doctor hits your knee and your leg kicks. It's the same kind of reaction. It's completely out of your control.
I've never heard that before.
Definitely.
Yeah. I've never heard that. I find that quite surprising.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing, and there's some research on it, not a ton, but it's super important that we talk about because, again, imagine you're a victim. You were not consenting. You were saying no, even, or you were just whatever, fight, flight, freeze. You did not want to be in the situation, but your body, because again, it's just nerve endings. They don't connect to whether you want to do something or not. They just kind of act independently. Give you these feelings, and you think, well, does that mean I was secretly consenting? And then, especially again, if the perpetrator picks up on that, it's horrible because, again, we especially think about male victims. The male anatomy is so prone to just being reactionary. You touch a young man or any man of any age, and he'll get an erection. And, then the perpetrator says, well, clearly you consented. No matter what you're saying, you're crying, whatever, it doesn't matter. Your body reacted in this way. I know you liked what I was doing. Therefore, you're at fault. And think about imagining explaining that to a nurse when you want to get a SANE exam, you want to get a rape kit, or to the police when they're interviewing you. Do you want to talk about that part of it?
And that's exactly where it's going.
Painful.
Yeah. So let me. Are you aware of people who've actually had an orgasm during a rape?
Yes.
Okay. So we know it exists. You've seen it personally, or you're aware of it personally.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I'm thinking. So, you wouldn't. I can't imagine anyone telling that to the police. But now that you brought it up, and let's say I'm some cunning defense attorney, and I don't think you're a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Irrespective of my experience, would it, and a rape victim is testifying, would that be fair game for an attorney to ask that question? If now he's that educated in this, would that be fair game?
Well, again, if they wanted to perpetrate that myth and that belief that, again, a body's just reaction somehow implies consent. But I think that that's exactly why, because I know an attorney can find this research the same way I have. I mean, right. it's out there that this is a phenomenon. That's why we have to train our general public who are on our juries. We have to train, people who are going to be potential victims, as any of us could be. We have to train lawyers. We have to train, police and detectives. All these people have to understand that this is something that can happen. And that person is going to feel additional shame and additional blaming of themselves. And again, I think it is really important that, like we're saying, someone could bring that up in a case, just like they used to bring up, what were you wearing? Where were you? What were you saying?
Your previous sexual life, right?
Right. And so we have to, as a society, talk about these things and bust these myths and say this has nothing to do with consent, so that they can't be used against victims, and so that people can talk about them honestly and get help.
Wow. Yeah, there's a complexity I wasn't aware of, and it shows you how hard it is with these cases to treat the victim with, with respect and dignity, and let them go through the process while trying to give the accused a fair trial as well.
Right.
We have to do both. Let's go back to this incident, this events, as we call them, irrespective of who did it. We have a female. She agrees to get tied up and blindfolded, and then he photographs her against her will, and she doesn't come forward. Does all this sound like plausible to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right, nothing unusual.
Absolutely, I totally believe it.
All right.
Yeah.
So we talked about sort of the victim profile. Tell us a little bit about the offender profile. You've probably seen many instances of that kind of behavior. Again, we're just looking at the scenario. We're not blaming anybody. We're not trying that case. Have you seen many cases of this type of behavior? That male dominance. And what do you see in terms of the profile and similarities in those cases?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. And so for me, in what I do, most people kind of only do the victimology. They only do work with victims. But I do work with both perpetrators and victims. And I feel like that allows me to treat everybody equitably and to also really understand what conversations we need to have, because I hear both perspectives. I get to see both personalities and see what issues led up to both sides of it. So when I work with the respondents, as we call them, the perpetrator, it is so important to remember that all of these crimes are crimes of power. They're not about desiring sex. So, it's not that, he was so, just horny and wanted to have sex so bad, and that's why he went to these extremes to cover it up, because it was just something he needed in his life. It's 100% about power. And sex is something that is very powerful, and when you take that power away from someone in their sexual body, that is essentially, I believe, the ultimate power you can have over someone in a really horrible way. And that's why these crimes are so damaging. So for him, I see a couple of things. I see one, again, he had a position of power. I believe from what I've read about him, he is Caucasian, he is male, he is able-bodied, he's cisgendered, he's heterosexual, meaning he holds all of the privileges in society. So again, he's been socialized that maybe people owe him things. We see that a lot. This girl owes me this. I'm this amazing guy. Therefore, she should be glad that I gave her this kind of attention. But then it's really fascinating because in that dynamic, both with the position of power, but also with the dynamic of toxic masculinity, the kind of masculinity that wants to hurt other people and dominate other people, particularly women, you see this fragility, this fear, right, of, well, I have this power, but don't you dare take it from me because I really like it. So I'm going to, threaten you with blackmail because the power that I hold over you, I'm again, very afraid of losing. I feel like, at any time you could tell somebody this happened and it could hurt my career, hurt my marriage, all this stuff. So I see that a lot, again, whether we're working with young people or, people who are older and in their careers, it's a very similar dynamic of one being owed things, believing that, this is just my right for whatever reason, to have this power over someone. And then, and then again, that fear of, well, I have to control that power and keep it. So that's what I see there.
I've always heard that, and even when I was studying these matters, it's a matter of power, not sex. But it does have a sexual mode. Is it the power that creates, the sexual excitement? Because we can't say there isn't any, sexual desire involved there. They are having, sex. They are achieving orgasm, the offender. So what is it? Is it, again, is it the sex a byproduct of the power? Are they Are they consistent with each other? They work together? How does that interact?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing. And I think, social scientists like myself are still trying to kind of unpack why this is. But again, it kind of goes back to something I said a few minutes ago where, sex is very powerful. Whether you're using it for love, for procreation, for connection to another human being in a good way, it's a powerful way to connect and show someone you care and show your devotion to someone. It's a very powerful way that we non-verbally communicate with each other as mammals. Some anthropologists have studied that, how sex is a tool of communication. And so all of those dynamics, of course, can be the reverse. If you want to destroy someone emotionally, if you want to really get into the most secret, private part of themselves that they hold just for themselves, to hurt somebody sexually is probably, if not the, for sure, most profound way to damage a human being. Because you even think about like our bodies, our genitals, we cover them. There are private parts since we're little children. So for someone to go in there, the place that no one else is allowed to see or touch or go, and to hurt that place, it's really to kill somebody's soul, And so I think that's the connection. I think it's the fact that sex is so powerful. And then in cultures where we see very, very little to no sexual violence, and there are a few of them, they're very small kind of tribal communities that have been studied. What we see is that sex has a different kind of respect. As far as people are empowered about sex, it's not something that's shameful. It's not something that, their desires aren't made fun of or told that they have to, be hidden. And in cultures where there's more kind of a puritanical, sex is bad, sex is dirty, sex is gross, that's where we see more sexual abuse. So a big part of it is, the more we empower people to talk about sex and to talk honestly about it and to not feel shame around it, that empowers people to not be victimized. And it also empowers people, I think, to not desire this kind of dominance over other human beings.
And, we can't ignore the Me Too movement, which is out there. And again, we see, women coming forward, and, a lot of people I know cast some doubt upon, it's just people jumping on the bandwagon. They're looking for money. We know that allegations of sexual assault are rare. They do occur, but they're rare. In the Me Too movement cases that we've seen, these allegations against these stars, again, are you seeing this consistency in the profile of the offender? Privileged individual, male, power. Are you seeing that all over again, similar to what we see in this other scenario of the alleged act, and also similar to what you see just in your day-to-day, the people we don't hear about who are engaging in sexual violence?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I definitely see that. And, here's a really interesting thing that's happened recently that feeds into all of this. Is it's not only who are the people who are, being accused of these crimes, because I do think there is a similar profile. I do think there's a lot more that this movement has to touch upon, because it still has not addressed any kind of dynamics of female perpetrators, which is totally something that needs, again, to be talked about as well. So far, it's mostly focused on women being victims and males being perpetrators. But there's a lot more layers to this in order for us to keep talking about sexual violence. But one of the things that came up recently that I really thought there's those dynamics at play was the reaction that Tony Robbins had. Because it's not only who's being accused, it's who's having a negative reaction and who's having a positive reaction. So you'll see positive reactions to these topics from a lot of women, anyone who's in a minority status, people with disabilities, people who are even, sex workers, just a whole different variety of groups who have said, you know what, my story, I felt like hasn't been heard. I feel like I haven't had the platform to talk about this. I want to share what's going on now. I'm so excited that we're starting this conversation. So those people are all excited about it. Who's threatened by it are people who hold power and who benefit from other people letting them do what they want.
Interesting.
And I think that's really important for people to be aware of. And it doesn't mean that all the people who are bothered by it are violent or perpetrators or, somehow sexually deviant. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, whenever we see issues of equity, so equity is different from equality because equity is about, people who've been disadvantaged getting, more resources, more support, more platforms so that things are fair. And when we see equity dynamics, when we see people who've been marginalized start to have a voice, start to have time, to share what they need, to share their perspective, what happens is the people who are in power feel like it's some kind of inequality. So equity feels like inequality when you've been in a position of privilege. And that's a superhuman reaction. To feel like, what's this about? What's going on? And, even when we're talking about consent, right? I've had a number of men come up to me in the past few months and say, I feel like guys can't do anything anymore. I feel like this is ridiculous. I feel like this consent thing is out of control. And what they're really saying subconsciously is, I never really had to think about this stuff because I, as a man, in negotiating sexual interactions with women, kind of got to do what I wanted to do for a large part of the time. I mean, like we were talking about in movies or whatever, right? That was what the characters in the movies and the songs and the books got to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's unnerving, and that makes people have to see the world differently, see sex differently, see relationships differently. Of course they're going to push back and say, I don't know what this is about. Maybe this is too much, And I think it's about making, again, these conversations approachable and being uncomfortable and saying, you know what, this is tough stuff. This is not going to be solved quickly. And then, again, hiring professionals like myself to come in and help people digest these things within, again, schools, agencies, government organizations, wherever, because our whole society has to grow and change. Right.
Now, you mentioned you work with the offender sometime. In what capacity
Mm-hmm.
is that? Was that a sort of a court-ordered consultation, or how does that come about that you're working with the
Mm-hmm.
offender?
So a lot of times it's with schools. I've had experiences where I am hired as a remediation person. So, for example, with Title IX, I'm sure you've heard there's mm-hmm. been a lot going on with that. And schools have to both serve the victims, but they also have to make sure the respondent, who is the perpetrator or the accused, that they also get resources and they get kind of, a fair and equitable experience. And so sometimes there are situations where the misconduct is seen as something that kind of falls on the lower end of the spectrum, or like the beginning of the continuum of harm. And they think that there's an opportunity to intervene and work with that individual and explain to them, what they did wrong and how they can make amends and what they can do moving forward. And so, again, I get called in and kind of, I'm a version of restorative justice, of saying to the individual, this is why this is problematic. This is what we need to do to fix it as much as possible. And then third, this is what you need to understand to move forward with your life so that you don't become, a problem in society, so that you aren't a danger to your community, because clearly you didn't understand why what you were doing was wrong. And so I'm the educational piece, and I work with them over time to kind of uncover that and make sure that, again, they fully understand, what they were doing, why it was problematic, and what to do to move forward.
Interesting. When we've had these conversations on the show a lot about mass shooters, and we always talk about red flags, things that we see. We always talk about indications, serial killers. We look back at their lives and we talk about, how they treated animals, how they treated other kids, similar to that. When you see these offenders, do you see these similar red flags or behavior patterns in their childhood that not always, but tend to be consistent or come up frequently in these people who become sexual offenders?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there definitely is a certain kind of dynamic that lends itself more. And there's a couple of dimensions to it. One of the big things that we see that's a big red flag, and we see it in little kids, and again, longitudinally we can kind of track that as they become adults, they're more likely to offend. And that is young people who seem to have a disregard or a sense of apathy for the people around them. And this can show itself in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that we actually see, which I think is really interesting, is the kind of humor or comments or bullying that these very young children make, again, who later are more likely to offend. And that can be things like, making fun of their peers for disabilities. We see a strong connection between homophobic remarks, so young people who make fun of a classmate for being quote unquote gay, or making fun of their gender identity. But it's interesting because they really are all connected. And again, we see in communities and cultures where it's okay to make fun of women or to make jokes, or people say, "Oh, we're just kidding." Well, those are the environments and those are the individuals that we then see with these violent, hugely problematic behaviors.
How early in life do you start seeing these red flags?
The research I've seen starts around 5 to 8 years old.
Wow.
And again, it's not one thing. There's a lot of factors there. Even why are they bullying, their classmates, or why are they, being a problem in their communities that young? Well, that can be their family. that can be psychological, but it can be both the nature and the nurture. The good news is the nurture we can control. We can, again, shift as a society and say, when we start to see those behaviors that young, we're going to step in and make sure they understand that, a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding of other people's viewpoints, a lack of caring about someone else's feelings is a really big problem, and we're not going to let them grow up and become that offender, without us at least trying really hard to nip it in the bud.
But let's look from a practical point. We have a 5-year-old, 6-year-old engaging in what we call antisocial behavior, touching other kids inappropriately, bullying. You tell a parent that these are the signs of a sexual offender in the making. What's that parent going to say? 9 times out of 10.
Well, of course they're going to say, "Yeah, not my child."
Not my child. They're just a kid. They're going to outgrow it, right?
Right.
Right. The same problem we talk about when we see red flags. We think it'll be violent. We say this kid is turned into a shooter. Oh, they're just kids. How do we get over that? I mean, I know it's a matter of education, but as parents, as people, aren't we just going to continue to be resistant to the fact that our kid is a potential sexual offender or violent offender in any way? How do you get parents to believe that those red flags are real in their child?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think it's a couple things. I think it's one, how we approach the parents or the community even. We don't want to be fatalistic. We don't want to say, oh, your child is destined to be like this horrible person and end up in jail and just be a menace to society. We don't want to say it that way. What we want to say is, these are really serious, concerning behaviors. And because we care about your child and because we care about their long-term well-being, we want to make sure that they get the resources they need, which is education, counseling, that kind of support network. so that they don't go down a road that nobody wants to see them go down, And honestly, that's one of the reasons I do what I do with offenders. Again, it's easier to support people who've been victimized because it's easy to have compassion for them.
Right.
It's really hard to have compassion for violent offenders. But throwing them all in jail or throwing them all away doesn't actually solve anything because.
But if you do that, you're a bleeding heart liberal. You're the problem, right? If you take that
right.
approach.
Well, I'm sure there's people who think that, and that's okay. They have a right to their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, I mean, even if you don't want to look at it from a compassion standpoint, financially, do you want to pay for all of these people to live in jail forever? I don't think so. Or even if you said, oh, we should just kill them all, that's expensive too. So what is the better solution? Can we intervene earlier on? Can we put in support and help people to understand, why this is important? Because we do have this window of opportunity to prevent them from being a bigger problem and costing taxpayers more. And, and just, again, being a person who then doesn't have a future. So from whatever angle you want to come at it as why it's important, it is important.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when we talk about, the shooter, which comes up often in this show and conversations, and we're talking about mental health, and certainly you and I are talking about mental health now. And, as I always point out with the shooter, all the experts I've had on the show always tell me the same thing. Even if we could have interviewed a Las Vegas shooter 2 weeks, a month beforehand, we would not have identified him as having some diagnosable, something we could diagnose and getting him committed involuntarily. Nor could we have said he's going to be a shooter. Or if we thought he was going to be a shooter, we couldn't have said when. Can I assume we have the same issue with the sexual offender that you're talking about now? We can see the red flags, but talking to them 2 weeks before they commit their first violent act is not going to do it. You're not going to diagnose them. You're not going to be able to pinpoint if and when it's going to happen. Same scenario, right? Or not right?
No, I definitely agree. I mean, we can see problematic behavior. We can even see them, like, for example, in in a kind of communal group, for example, with fraternities. We see so many sexual crimes with fraternities. And you might say, oh, well, this fraternity had these problematic parties and themes and made these comments. And, we should have known they might do something terrible, like a gang rape. But you can't actually know that because, of course, there are problematic people who don't end up committing crimes. And, again, we can't lock everybody up and just throw away the key. So I think what the solution is, going back to the example of what happened with the allegations of the Missouri governor, what it comes down to is two things. One, socially, we have to make it completely unacceptable for any of these behaviors to go on. So that if everybody in a community says, hey, that's not funny, the things that you're saying, the ways you're behaving, they're not kind of okay. They're problematic and they lead to bigger problems. So we're going to shut them down because we're not going to allow you to continue to get away with that kind of, words, actions, whatever. Two, it's about empowering people, because, again, any of us can be victimized, that we have a right when something happens to us to speak up immediately and be supported by our community. So when I think about where, again, maybe she was in the situation that we're talking about, she might have consented to being tied up and to having sex. However, she definitely 100% has said she did not at all consent to having her picture taken, and then he threatened her with that. And what I see there is it's actually a case of sexual exploitation if he used that picture against her. And she had real fear because she knew her community and her family and her friends had a high chance of turning against her for having this relationship and for being violated. And so if she thought, you know what, if you take this picture, I did nothing wrong. You're the one who's hurting me. I'm going to get support. Everyone's going to stand behind me. Everyone's going to believe me because, again, they know that, I'm honest. They know that most cases are 100% true, that false accusations are extremely rare. If that's what she thought, if that's what we train people to know, if that's what society believes, that's when we'll see all of these sexual crimes go down.
Interesting.
Because people will know they can't get away with it. And right now we have 38 states, thank goodness, that's a pretty large number from a few years ago, that have what we call revenge porn, quote unquote, laws on the books. And that's what this would fall into. If she said, if you take this picture of me, there's a law on the books right now in the state that, I can totally charge you with a crime against me because this is a crime against me. And so I'm safe. You don't have a right to hurt me like this. Right. And then that person who might have that kind of profile where they have issues for whatever many reasons with being violent, with being, sexually aggressive, emotionally abusive, they're going to know, you know what? I can't get away with this. I better not do it.
So all this education has to start very young, right?
Very young.
Do we need to change? Young. Do we need to change our educational level? The way we educate our kids, maybe to start including this type, and I'm not even sure what type of education I'm describing, but something to make our children realize what is acceptable, what is not, to understand how they can be empowered to protect themselves. Are we falling down in that regard?
Oh yeah, definitely. So far, I know that the state of California has consent education, I think, every year of primary school and then secondary school. And then I know Rhode Island at least had a law that I think was going to the House for them to have the same thing. When people ask me, how young do we have to educate kids about consent, for example, I tell them, I'm like, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, and they look at me and they're like, well, I'm not going to tell my 2-year-old about sex. And I said, it's not about sex. You have to teach them empathy and, again, getting consent for a million things before it ever becomes that they're of an age where it goes into the sexual realm.
Interesting.
If, with my kids, because, again, I'm a mom, so I do this too, for example, playing with a friend. If they're coercing their friend, oh, you better play this game with me, or I'm not going to talk to you anymore, or they're not taking their no for an answer. Their friend says, I don't want to play this game, or I don't want, or even with little children, child says, I don't want to be tickled, and again, the people around them or their friends or whatever are saying, oh, you're fine, you don't mean it, you don't mean this, no, or I'm going to eventually convince you that you like it. Those are the things, those are the seeds that are planted that do become the sexual violence we see, 10, 20 years down the road.
Interesting.
And so we have to teach little children in kindergarten and on, to respect when people say no to you, to read people's cues when they're uncomfortable, to ask before doing something, to be empathetic. If we did that, 99.9% of the work would be done.
Wow, very interesting.
But most people aren't doing that.
So many changes. We need a new paradigm of education, perhaps, in this country.
It's one of the things I'm trying to do.
Now, let me ask you one last question on this. And again, looking at trying to draw a parallel between this violent behavior and the shooter, do we need mental health professionals in grade schools? Do we need kids to be assessed? Do we need to train teachers how to make that referral? Are we starting way too late in life on mental health issues?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, yeah, on so many levels. And another part of this is that you're bringing up, again, people think, even with sexual crimes, that, this is something that happens in college, in the workplace, as adults. It happens both to little children from adults, but also child to child. People don't want to talk about that. I had a victim who I worked with that at 3 years old was raped, was digitally penetrated by a 6-year-old. And it was on a daily basis for months. And they didn't tell anyone their whole life until I was working with them and they were in their 50s. it happens at every age. So if we have mental health workers and educators at every grade level, you will also start getting a lot of reports. And you will start to see victims who are sadly 5 years old, but you will also start to see children who have been abused by others who are now perpetrators, very often so unknowingly. But again, we need to address that immediately, not when they're 30 years old,
right.
And now they have, they're on the registry and they're in jail and their whole life is over. We could have addressed that when they were very, very, very young and we first saw that there was a problem. So absolutely, it should be every age.
A new paradigm, as we said. I think, again, I talk mostly about the violent behavior, the shooters. We need to get mental health into the school system, and we need to do it now at an early age.
Yep.
Wow, so many things to do. I've learned a lot speaking with you. Before we go, tell us a little bit about your next stage of life and your professional work. I know you have some plans to make some changes soon.
Yeah. So I'm really excited because all the opportunities I've had working for organizations has been just really incredible, and I love what I do. But I've known that for a while, really the future will be being able to kind of go to different agencies and different schools and different groups and work with them and consult with them and also be an expert witness in these kinds of crimes. And so this June, in 2018, I'm starting the National Center for Equity and Agency, and it's going to be a consulting and expert witness firm. And really our focus is to empower organizations and individuals to tackle the topics of everything from cultural humility to sexual misconduct and inclusion so that we can try to increase the structural equity and diversity in all of these different situations. So I'm really excited to be doing that and, to be more available, to go around the country, to go around the globe, and again, have these conversations that we're having today because there's still so much more work to do there.
There is. Do you have a website you'd like to point everyone to?
Yeah. So right now you can reach me at my personal website, which is drlauramaguire.com. And then in June, you can also find me at equityandagency.com.
Fantastic. Laura, Dr. McGuire, I've learned a lot today. The bad news is I think there will be more stories, and we may want to have you back on for your expertise as time goes on.
Definitely. I'd love to do it.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great speaking with you.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, I think we had a really interesting conversation today with Dr. Laura McGuire. She gave some great insights, and unfortunately some of that is troubling insight, but we learned a lot. Please, again, watch us on YouTube. You can see all our back shows on there. Become a subscriber. Hit that little icon. Become a subscriber. Like us on Facebook. Again, on both places, we are Crimes and Times and spelled out. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Michael Tabman. Good night.